Welcome to Dead Scary Stories. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share and subscribe. Also comment where and what time you're watching from. Now lie back, relax and let sleep consume you. The monitor's screen was a faint blue glow on my bedside table. The nursery bathed in its usual grainy, black and white image. I glanced at it again before settling back against the pillows. The cot was still. The baby blanket rose and fell in that rhythmic way that always gave me a fragile sort of comfort. I couldn't hear anything, but that didn't strike me as odd. Lily had been restless earlier, but now she was still. It was only when I reached to switch off the bedside lamp that I noticed the tiny red icon in the corner of the screen. The speaker was muted. My stomach tightened in that instinctive, inexplicable way it does when something small but out of place nags at the edges of your mind. I didn't remember muting it, but I told myself I probably had without thinking. Exhaustion does strange things. I pressed the button to unmute, expecting nothing more than the soft sound of her breathing. Instead, there was a faint rustling. It was so faint I had to hold the monitor closer to be sure. It wasn't her blanket, I realized. It wasn't the tiny, restless shifts of a baby in sleep. It was bigger. A soft shuffle. It came from just beyond the cot, somewhere outside the camera's narrow view. I sat up fully, my hand gripping the edge of the duvet. I stared at the monitor, willing the camera to pick up something more. The static-filled rustling grew faint again, then stopped. For a second I thought it was over, that perhaps I'd imagined it altogether. Then a soft creak broke the silence, faint but unmistakable. The sound of the nursery floorboards. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I slid out of bed, my heart racing. I was halfway to the nursery when the house alarm erupted. The high-pitched wail cut through the silence, shaking me to the core. I froze, panic swallowing every rational thought. The alarm meant a breach, a window or door forced open. I sprinted down the hallway, the monitor clutched in my hand. Lily's door was ajar, and for the briefest second I thought I saw movement inside. My fingers fumbled with the light switch as I pushed the door open. The cot was empty. The blanket was crumpled, one corner draped over the bars. I turned towards the window, the monitor screen forgotten in my grip. The curtains billowed slightly, as if disturbed, though the window was closed. My breath came in short, panicked bursts as I crossed the room and checked the latch. It was locked, firmly in place. Something scraped behind me. I spun around, the monitor clattering to the floor as my gaze darted to the wardrobe. It stood half open, a dark sliver of space visible between the doors. My chest felt tight, my feet rooted to the floor. I stared at the gap, willing it to remain still. It didn't. The door moved, just a fraction, but enough for the dim light to catch something inside. The pale, gleaming surface of an eye. I backed out of the room without thinking, nearly stumbling as I slammed the door shut behind me. The alarm was still wailing, the shrill sound pressing against my ears as I fumbled for my phone in the hallway. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it, but I managed to call for help. I stood there, staring at the nursery door as I waited, every second stretching endlessly. When the police arrived, they found nothing. The wardrobe was empty, the cot undisturbed apart from the crumpled blanket. The window latch was intact and the alarm system showed no record of an entry. They checked the rest of the house, every cupboard and corner, but there was no sign of anyone. Lily was in her cot again when I returned. I found her in the middle of the room, lying peacefully under the same crumpled blanket. The officers assured me it was impossible, that I must have missed her in my panic, but I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd heard. I can't explain how she got there. I can't explain who or what was in that wardrobe. The only thing I know is that I haven't muted the monitor since. The monitor sat on the bedside table, its glow painting the dark room in shades of blue and grey. I couldn't take my eyes off it, even as my husband turned over and settled into the mattress. The cot filled the frame, the tiny shape of our daughter wrapped snugly in her blanket. The camera's faint infrared buzz was the only sound, the background static almost comforting after so many nights of this routine. The cot didn't move. She didn't stir. The faint rise and fall of her breathing was steady, reassuring. I rubbed my thumb over the edge of the monitor, about to reach for the button to switch it off. Then something flickered, a brief disturbance at the edge of the screen. My hand froze as I stared at the monitor, the static now feeling louder in my ears. The flicker came again, and this time I caught it. From underneath the cot, just at the bottom of the frame, something emerged. a small hand, pale and bony, the fingers curled awkwardly as it pressed against the floorboards. It was gone just as quickly, retreating into darkness before I could fully register what I'd seen. My chest tightened as the screen erupted into static. The grainy picture vanished, replaced by a burst of white noise. Then, faintly through the interference, I heard a cry. Not a wail, not the soft sounds my daughter usually made in her sleep, but something distant, as if muffled by walls or space. It came from the nursery. I was out of bed before I knew it, the monitor still clutched in my hand. My husband was up too, moving behind me as I pushed the door to the nursery open. The sound stopped as soon as we stepped in, and the room was still. Too still. The cot was exactly as it should have been. My daughter lay on her back, her tiny chest rising and falling, her face peaceful. The mobile above her spun gently, the plastic animals swaying. My pulse was pounding, my eyes darting across the room, searching for the source of the cry, for any sign of what I'd seen. That's when I noticed the window. It was open just a crack, the curtains stirring faintly in the breeze. I could have sworn we'd closed it earlier. I stepped over, my breath catching as I gripped the frame. The latch was loose, but nothing outside seemed disturbed. The garden below was dark and still, the street beyond empty. I locked the window again, pulling the curtain shut with trembling hands. I checked the wardrobe next, my fingers fumbling as I opened the door. It was empty but for the neatly folded clothes inside. The crawl space in the corner was the last place to check. It hadn't been opened in years, not since we moved in. I knelt down and ran my fingers along the edge. The paint was untouched, the floor unmarked. When I finally turned back to the cot, my daughter hadn't moved. She let out a soft sigh in her sleep, her tiny fist twitching. I reached out and adjusted her blanket, my hand brushing her warm cheek. The monitor was still in my hand, the static having cleared to reveal the familiar picture of the nursery. Everything looked normal, and yet I couldn't shake the image of that hand. The way it had moved, how it had appeared and disappeared so suddenly. It wasn't possible. But it had been there. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting in the rocking chair near the cot, my eyes fixed on the window and the monitor in turn. The latch stayed shut, the screen stayed clear. My daughter slept soundly, never stirring, never crying. But when dawn broke, I couldn't stop thinking about the cry, about how faint it had been, as if it hadn't come from the cot at all. I didn't check beneath the cot. I still haven't. The monitor was propped up on the nightstand next to me, its soft, dim glow the only light in the room. I was half asleep when I noticed the gurgling sound. It was bright and cheerful, the kind of sound that always came with Lily flailing her arms or kicking at the air. It was a relief in a way. She'd had a rough night and her fussing had finally quietened down an hour ago. I didn't move at first, just listened, comforted by the happy noises coming from the other room. It didn't last long. The gurgles faded, replaced by an odd stretch of silence. Something about it tugged at me, but I still didn't move, staring at the glowing screen on the monitor instead. It showed Lily's cot, the pale bars framing her little form under the blanket. I could just make out her tiny hand resting on her chest, and everything seemed fine. Still, I reached over and turned up the volume, hoping to hear her soft breathing or a rustle of movement. There was nothing. A strange, sharp chill settled over me as I swung my legs out of bed. The flat was quiet, no hum of the fridge or groan of the old pipes. I padded down the hallway to her room, my steps louder than I'd intended on the worn floorboards. And when I reached the door, I paused for a moment before stepping inside. The cot was empty. The blanket was crumpled near the bottom, and the small pillow sat undisturbed where her head should have been. My heart thudded, the sound of it filling my ears as I darted around the cot, scanning the room in disbelief. There was no sign of her. The changing table was untouched, the stuffed animals still arranged neatly on the shelf above. The curtains were drawn, though they swayed ever so slightly, as if disturbed by a faint draught. I turned and ran out of the room. The sitting room, the kitchen, the bathroom. I checked them all, calling her name in my head with each frantic step. Every door was locked, every window secured. The air seemed too still, the silence oppressive in a way I couldn't explain. I came back to the nursery, my breath tight in my chest. The cot looked exactly as I'd left it, empty and undisturbed. I stepped closer, hands gripping the rails as I tried to piece together what could possibly have happened. My mind flitted between possibilities that made no sense. Had she climbed out somehow? Had I missed something obvious in the other rooms? And then I heard it again, the gurgling. It came from the monitor on the bedside table in my room. I stood frozen for a moment, the sound so distinct and close that it felt as though she were right next to me. I turned on my heel and ran back to my room. The monitor screen glowed softly in the dark, and there she was, in the cot, back where she'd been all along, her tiny hands flapping at her sides as she giggled up at nothing in particular. My legs felt unsteady as I stumbled to the nursery again, my breath catching as I peered inside. She was there, lying in the cot as though she'd never left. The blanket was pulled neatly up to her chest, her pillow tucked just under her head. It was impossible. My head swam as I leaned against the wall, staring at her peaceful little face. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed up, replaying the footage from the monitor on my phone. I had to understand what had happened. The timeline didn't make sense. The app showed nothing at first, just her sleeping soundly, the occasional shift as she turned her head or stretched. Then, at 2:42 a.m., there was a glitch. A quick flash of distortion, the screen briefly warping before going dark for 2 seconds. When the image returned, the cot was empty. My stomach turned as I skipped ahead, fast-forwarding through minutes of footage that showed nothing but stillness. At 2:49 a.m., the cot was suddenly full again. Lily swaddled under the blanket as though she'd never been gone. I rewound it, staring at the missing minutes, my pulse thudding in my throat. That's when I saw it. Just before the glitch, something moved at the edge of the frame. A dark shape, a figure leaning into the cot. The angle was too wide to make out details, but it was unmistakable. Someone had been in her room. I froze the frame, zooming in as far as the grainy image would allow. The figure reached towards the cot, and then the screen blinked out. That was it, nothing else. No sign of entry, no sound, no clue how they'd gotten in or out. I stood there for a long time, staring at the image until the phone screen went black. Every instinct told me to get her out of the house, to leave immediately. But as I turned back to the monitor on the table, I could see Lily sleeping soundly in the cot, her tiny chest rising and falling. It's been 3 nights now, and I've checked every lock and window a dozen times since then. Nothing explains how they got in, nothing explains where they went, but I can't bring myself to watch the footage again. I don't want to see what might be hiding in those missing minutes. The monitor had been acting up for a week or so before I really noticed. At first it was small things, a flicker here, a flash of static there. The image would warp slightly when I shifted the camera remotely, the kind of glitch you'd expect from cheap electronics. Lily was always fine when I checked on her, snug under her blanket or curled on her side. It was enough to dismiss it as a quirk. Babies need so much stuff, and half of it never works properly, but then the glitches started to feel different. I'd glance at the monitor and catch the camera jolting slightly, like it was being knocked. Sometimes the feed would distort, not just with static, but with these strange shapes, dark smudges bleeding into the frame before vanishing. It was easy enough to ignore in daylight, with Lily's gurgles and babbles filling the flat, but at night, in the small hours when the house was quiet, the screen's glow felt colder, the distortions more deliberate. The night I decided to check the footage was the night it all changed. It was just after midnight. Lily had been down for hours, and I'd been half watching something on the telly when the monitor flickered on the table next to me. The picture wobbled, the sound hissed faintly, and then nothing. A blank screen. I frowned, reached for the camera controls on my phone, and refreshed the feed. It came back almost immediately, but the angle was different, off-center. The cot wasn't where it should have been in the frame. I went into her room, assuming the bracket had slipped. Everything looked normal. Lily was asleep, one small hand curled by her face. I straightened the camera and adjusted the angle back to where it was supposed to be. Then I went back to the living room, convinced it was fine, but it wasn't. The monitor blinked out again as I settled on the sofa. This time I didn't adjust it. I opened the app and scrolled back through the recorded clips instead, flicking through timestamps until I found the moments just before the feed had gone blank. The footage began as normal. Lily lying in her cot, her blanket rising and falling with her breaths. The picture wobbled again, a strange, almost liquid ripple across the screen. And then there was something else. A movement, brief but sharp, on the edge of the frame. I rewound the clip, slowing it down, my stomach tightening as I watched. There it was, a shadow, no, a shape, darting past the camera, so quick it was almost imperceptible. It wasn't Lily. It couldn't have been. It moved too fast, too purposefully. I watched it again and again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shadow disappeared just as I stepped into the room. I went back in with the kind of numb resolve that comes from refusing to think too much. I turned the light on, scanning the room with fresh eyes. The cot, the changing table, the soft toys piled in the corner. Everything was where it should have been. Still, I couldn't shake the image from my head. That blur of movement, the way it vanished just before I arrived. It was the wall that caught my attention in the end. The far wall opposite the cot. There was a faint outline near the skirting board, almost imperceptible, like a crack that had been painted over hastily. I crouched down, pressing my fingertips against it, and felt a slight give, a hollow space. I pulled at it, scraping away flakes of paint and plaster, until a panel came free. Behind it was an opening. A crawl space, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I shone my phone torch into the darkness. The beam stretched only a few feet before it was swallowed by shadows. The space reeked of damp and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. The walls were lined with insulation that had long since yellowed, shredded in places as though something had clawed at it. I tried to see further, but the tunnel curved, vanishing into the kind of darkness that feels alive. I backed away, my skin prickling. I put the panel back in place, though it didn't sit flush anymore. The edges of the opening were ragged, the paint chipped where I'd pried it open. That night I moved the cot into my room. I told myself it was just for a few days, just until I could figure out what to do about the crawl space, but I couldn't sleep, not properly. Every sound in the flat felt magnified, every creak and groan like footsteps moving through the walls. The next morning I packed a bag for Lily and took her to my mum's. I haven't been back to the flat since. I've told myself I'll go tomorrow, that I'll call someone to come and seal the crawl space properly. But I keep thinking about the footage, about the way the camera jolted as though something had bumped it, and about the thing, whatever it was, that moved so fast out of frame. It was just after 3 a.m. when the baby monitor woke us, not with a cry, but with laughter. High, sharp bursts that didn't belong to the soft giggles we usually coaxed out of Lily. They came fast, one after another, breaking the stillness of the bedroom. For a moment I thought it might be a dream, the sound too strange to belong to the real world. Then it came again, more insistent. My wife stirred next to me, her breath catching as we both turned to the monitor on the bedside table. The screen glowed pale blue in the dark, the image grainy and flickering faintly. Lily was there, sitting up in her cot. Her small hands clutched the edge of the railing as she leaned forward slightly. Her mouth was open in that same unsettling laughter, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere too deep for her little body. She was looking at something, fixated, unblinking, but the camera didn't show what. Whatever held her attention was just out of frame. We sat frozen, the room suddenly feeling too cold, the duvet bunched around my legs, offering no comfort. I got up, stepping gingerly onto the floorboards, and went to her room. The door creaked when I opened it. Her laughter had stopped by then. Lily was lying down again, her breathing soft and even, as if she'd never been awake at all. I stood there for what felt like ages, staring into the cot, half expecting to see someone or something still lingering in the corner. But there was nothing. The next day, we didn't say much about it. I think neither of us wanted to dwell on it too long. Just one of those things, I thought. Babies laugh at strange times, at nothing, at shadows. But the sound of it clung to me through the morning like a thread I couldn't let go of. While my wife went to the shops, I pulled up the monitor footage on my phone. The video quality wasn't great, the image jerky and distorted in places. Lily's laughter came through clearly, though, bright and unnatural in the stillness of the room. I dragged the playback cursor to the beginning of the clip and watched. She was asleep at first, her tiny fists bunched near her face. Then she stirred, her head turning sharply toward the left-hand corner of the room, the far side from the camera. She sat up in a single, fluid motion and began to laugh. Not like the joyful peals we were used to, but more frantic, as though she was responding to something unseen. Her gaze stayed fixed on the same spot throughout. It wasn't the casual glance of a baby noticing a passing light or toy. This was something else. Her eyes didn't waver. She leaned forward, rocking slightly, and her little hand reached out once towards the edge of the cot. Then the laughter stopped. She sat still for a moment, staring into the same corner before lying down as if nothing had happened. I paused the video and stared at the screen. The corner was barely visible in the footage, just a slice of shadow beyond the camera's field of view. It gnawed at me. I went into her room again, stepping carefully around her cot, where she lay napping peacefully. The corner was empty, as I'd known it would be, but something drew me towards it. The walls were bare apart from a faint smudge near the skirting board, a smear of some kind. Too faint to make out, I crouched down, my fingers brushing the wall almost instinctively. And then I found it, a small, clean-edged hole drilled into the plaster, no larger than the tip of a pen. I felt the air catch in my throat as I leaned in closer. The hole seemed to open into darkness, no insulation or wood behind it, as there should have been. I brought my phone torch up to it, shining the light in, but all it revealed was more of the same. A deep, narrow void, like the wall had been hollowed out far beyond what was visible. My stomach twisted as I straightened up. I moved Lily's cot away from the corner, sliding it gently across the floor. I didn't want her near it anymore, though I didn't know why. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. My wife noticed the cot had been moved, but didn't ask. I didn't explain. That night we kept the monitor on again. I couldn't bring myself to turn it off, no matter how much I wanted to. The house seemed quieter than usual, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every creak of the old house feeling sharper than it should. Sometime in the early hours, Lily started laughing again. It was different this time, quieter, almost muffled, as though she was trying to keep it in. The monitor flickered on the bedside table, the faint blue glow casting the room in an odd light. I turned to look at it, and my chest tightened. Lily wasn't in her cot. The camera was focused on the empty mattress, the blankets crumpled where she'd been. The sound of her laughter carried on, soft and distant somewhere beyond the frame. I couldn't move. The monitor screen flickered once, briefly distorting, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw the corner of the room, the one where the cot used to be. And something else. Something shifting in the hollow space of that wall. The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. The house was quiet when I woke up. Too quiet save for the faint crackle of the baby monitor on the bedside table. I'd grown used to its steady noise at night, a constant companion in the stillness, but now there was something else coming through, soft and unfamiliar. A sound that made me sit up before I'd even realized what it was. It was a tune, faint and uneven, like someone humming. The melody rose and fell, irregular, almost lazy, the way you might sing to yourself when you thought no one was listening. It took a moment for my sleep-heavy mind to register what felt so out of place about it. My husband wasn't home. His night shift at the hospital wouldn't end for hours. There shouldn't have been anyone in the house but me and the baby. I stared at the monitor, the screen showing a grainy, black and white image of the nursery. The cot was still. The small bundle of blankets shifted slightly, and I could make out the faint curve of Emma's head as she slept soundly. My breath caught as the humming grew louder, though the room itself remained still. The cot, the mobile above, the curtains, they didn't move. There was nothing else in view. I slid out of bed, my pulse quickening with each step I took down the hall. The sound hadn't stopped. It trailed faintly from the monitor, clutched in my hand, that same off-key melody, drifting through the static like something just out of reach. When I reached the nursery door, I hesitated. The air inside felt cooler than the rest of the house, a faint draft brushing against my skin. The room was exactly as it should have been. The curtains were drawn, the soft glow of the nightlight casting the cot in pale light. Emma lay there, still and peaceful, her chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of sleep. I stood over her, watching, waiting for something to shift. But nothing did. The humming had stopped. I glanced around the room, scanning every corner. The door to the wardrobe was shut tight, the changing table untouched. I even checked the latch on the window, pressing it down with my thumb to be sure. It didn't budge. Everything was secure. I stood there for a moment longer, then crept back to my room. It wasn't until I was under the covers again that I noticed how tightly I'd been gripping the monitor. My knuckles ached as I set it back on the table. The screen showed Emma just as I'd left her, still sleeping, still alone. but I couldn't shake the sound of the humming, the way it had filled the room even when nothing else had moved. I picked up my phone and opened the security app. We'd installed a camera in the nursery when Emma was born, one of those smart ones that kept a record of the past 12 hours. I tapped the timeline, scrolling back to the last few minutes, searching for any sign of what I'd heard. The feed was clear at first. Emma shifted a little under the blanket, her tiny fist twitching as she dreamed. The mobile swayed gently above her cot, its plastic animals spinning slowly, catching the faint glow of the nightlight. But then something changed. There was a flicker near the edge of the frame, just beyond the cot. It wasn't much, just a subtle shift in the shadows that shouldn't have been there. The mobile stopped moving, coming to a sudden halt as though someone had touched it. My heart was hammering now as I tapped the screen, rewinding the footage, watching the moment again and again. The shadow wasn't just a trick of the light. It moved, retreating from the cot just seconds before I entered the room. It disappeared into the corner near the wardrobe, melting into the darkness there. I strained my eyes, trying to make sense of it, trying to tell myself it was nothing, but the way it moved, it was too precise, too real. I shut off the app and set the phone down, my hands trembling. Emma was still sleeping on the monitor, safe in her cot. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been there hadn't really left. The wardrobe stood firmly shut when I checked it again, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I told myself I would call someone in the morning, check the locks, maybe even replace the camera. But as dawn crept in and Emma stirred in her cot, smiling up at the ceiling, I couldn't bring myself to look at the footage again. Whatever I might have seen, I didn't want to know. The baby monitor blinked quietly on the bedside table, its faint glow cutting through the dim light of the bedroom. I was propped up against the headboard, my eyes fixed on the screen. The cot filled most of the frame, a grainy grey rectangle illuminated by the nightlight. Our son was asleep, bundled in blankets, his tiny body still except for the faint rise and fall of his breathing. It had been weeks since I'd slept properly. I told myself I was just getting used to the monitor, the way it crackled faintly in the quiet, but I couldn't stop watching it. Every creak of the house, every rustle of fabric in the night, it all sent my attention back to the screen. I didn't know what I was expecting to see, but I couldn't look away. The picture on the monitor flickered suddenly, a momentary disruption in the feed. My stomach tightened as I leaned closer. The flicker happened again, this time longer, the screen shifting into static for just a second before the image returned. Then, with no sound or warning, the screen went completely black. I froze, staring at the dark rectangle in front of me, waiting for the image to return. It didn't. The power light on the monitor was still on, faintly glowing green. I checked my phone. The Wi-Fi was fine. My husband sat up beside me, already moving to check the light switch. The bedside lamp came on without issue, flooding the room with soft yellow light. The power was fine. Something about the monitor made me uneasy. I picked it up, tapping the buttons, cycling through the settings. Nothing. The image remained black. I didn't want to leave it like that, not without knowing what was going on in the nursery. I slid out of bed, my husband close behind, and made my way down the hall. The house felt too still. Each step I took amplified by the quiet. The nursery door creaked faintly as I pushed it open. The room was exactly as it should have been. The nightlight cast a pale glow across the cot, illuminating our son's peaceful face. He hadn't moved. The blankets were undisturbed, his breathing soft and steady. The camera sat mounted on the wall above the cot, its lens pointed down, the small indicator light still on. It was working, or at least it should have been. I checked the window next, then the wardrobe, then the corners of the room where the light didn't quite reach. Everything was in its place. Everything looked normal, but as I stood there, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. The air felt wrong. Cooler, maybe. The faint sound of the monitor's static buzzed in my head, though it wasn't actually there anymore. We returned to the bedroom, and I set the monitor back on the table. The screen was still dark. My hands were trembling slightly as I reached for my phone again, opening the security app. The camera in the nursery fed directly into the system. It saved footage, hours worth, that I could scroll through on my phone. I opened the feed, scrolling back to just before the screen had gone dark. The picture appeared as normal at first, the cot, the blankets, my son's tiny frame shifting slightly as he slept. But as the feed moved closer to the blackout, I noticed something strange. The last captured frame was unlike the others. The cot was still there, the blankets still visible, but there was something else in the frame, something I hadn't noticed while watching live. A figure was standing over the cot, its shape indistinct in the grey, the head bent forward as if looking down at my son. The frame froze there, perfectly still, then nothing. The video feed ended. No sound, no movement. Just the image of that figure, its outline, sharp and motionless, before the screen went black for good. I stared at it for what felt like hours. I couldn't make out any features. The shape didn't look right. Not like a person, not exactly. It was too tall, too narrow, its limbs bent in strange ways. I looked up at the monitor again, half expecting the screen to flicker back on, to show the room as it was now, empty, safe. But I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing there, inches from the cot. It hadn't been there when we checked, at least I hadn't seen it, but it had been there before, right before the screen went dark. The monitor never worked again. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It's still in the cupboard, buried under blankets. I never checked the footage again either. I don't think I could bear to see if the figure moved. I woke up to the faint glow of the baby monitor on the bedside table. It had become part of my nightly routine, checking the monitor whenever I stirred. I didn't wake easily these days. Every small noise or imagined sound jerked me into consciousness. I glanced at the screen out of habit, expecting to see the usual stillness of the nursery. Instead, something about the scene caught my eye. The door was ajar. It wasn't wide open, just enough to break the clean line of the frame. I knew I'd closed it before bed. I always did. It had become almost ritualistic, checking the windows, locking the back door, closing the nursery door snugly behind me. Seeing it like that, slightly open, made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself it was nothing. A draft, maybe. Houses settle in the night, shifting slightly as the temperature drops, but I couldn't pull my eyes away from the screen. The cot was where it should be, the nightlight giving everything that strange greyness you only see on these monitors. My baby was sound asleep, nestled in blankets, completely oblivious. The room was still, but the door, just barely open, seemed to change the feel of it entirely. I stared for longer than I should have, watching the edges of the frame as if something might move. When nothing did, I forced myself to put the monitor down, but I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the image of that door, slightly ajar, over and over again, trying to find an explanation that felt solid enough to ease me back into sleep. When I couldn't take it anymore, I reached for my phone and opened the monitor's app. It recorded everything, capturing moments in 30-second clips when motion was detected. I scrolled back through the feed, checking timestamps. There it was. At 2:37 a.m. the door was closed just as I'd left it. I tapped the clip to play it. The camera was fixed on the cot, so I could only see the door at the edge of the frame. The feed began as normal, the door firmly shut. A few seconds passed, and then, as if drawn by invisible hands, the door crept open. It didn't slam or jerk. It didn't swing wide or snap back like it had been caught by the wind. It just eased open, centimeter by centimeter, until it stopped. Then nothing. No one stepped into the room. The cot didn't shift. The blankets didn't move. The rest of the clip was uneventful. I replayed it again, my pulse quickening. There was no one in the hallway beyond the door. No shadows or flickers of movement. It was as if the door had opened itself. I got up and went to check the nursery. The hallway was empty, the air still and cold against my skin. The door was as I'd seen it on the monitor, slightly ajar. The hinges didn't creak as I pushed it open, which somehow made the silence worse. Inside, everything was exactly as it had been when I'd checked before bed. The cot was in its place, the nightlight glowing faintly. My baby slept soundly, breathing softly, undisturbed. The windows were locked. The door to the built-in wardrobe was closed. There was nothing out of place. I stared at the door for a long time. The thought of leaving it open made me uneasy. But closing it felt wrong, like shutting a trap door over something I didn't understand. I left it as it was, the gap exactly the same, and backed out of the room. I didn't go back to bed. I stayed on the sofa, the monitor clutched in my hand, the volume turned up. Every creak of the house, every shift in the wind sent my eyes darting back to the screen. But the door didn't move again. When morning came, the nursery was just as I'd left it. But that clip, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head, the way the door moved, so smooth, so steady, without any sign of what had caused it. I deleted the footage, not because I didn't want to see it again, but because I couldn't stand the thought of showing it to someone else and having them tell me what they saw. I woke in the dark to a jolt of awareness, the kind that grips you even before you understand why. My eyes adjusted to the dim light of the baby monitor glowing on the bedside table. Habit drove my hand to reach for it, my mind still fogged with sleep. The familiar grainy feed flickered onto the small screen, showing the nursery bathed in the faint artificial glow of the nightlight. At first nothing seemed out of place. The cot was in its usual spot, blankets draped over the small form of my baby. The room was still, the kind of stillness that should have been reassuring, but then I noticed it. My breath caught as my gaze fixed on a shape, wrong in its proportions, standing close to the cot. The figure was small, too small for an adult, but its presence was entirely out of place. The shape was humanoid, but the silhouette was somehow uneven, like limbs bent at unnatural angles. It stood just beyond the edge of the cot, unmoving. My heart pounded so violently that I could feel the vibration in my throat. It was looking down into the cot. I couldn't see a face, just the suggestion of a head cocked forward, the screen too grainy to give me anything more than that. I felt paralyzed, gripped by an icy terror that rooted me in bed. Then, with a sudden movement that made me recoil, the figure turned its head as if aware of my gaze through the monitor. I couldn't process what I was seeing. The shape crouched low, limbs folding and shrinking until it was hidden beneath the cot. The feed flickered slightly as I stared at the empty frame, my baby still sound asleep and unaware. I screamed before I could stop myself. The sound woke my husband, but I was already out of bed, clutching the monitor in my hand. I could barely get the words out as I pointed to the screen, my whole body trembling. He didn't ask questions, just leapt out of bed, both of us rushing towards the nursery. The door to the room was shut, just as I had left it. My husband threw it open, and the nightlight spilled its dim glow over the cot and its surroundings. My baby lay peacefully undisturbed. The cot was where it should be, the blankets neatly tucked. I dropped to my knees, peering beneath the cot. Nothing. The wooden floor was bare, apart from the occasional dust bunny near the edges. There was no crawl space, no gap large enough for anything to disappear into. The windows were shut and locked. The wardrobe was closed. My husband tried to calm me, to reassure me that I was overtired or imagining things, but I knew what I had seen. I replayed the image in my head, the figure, the bent shape, the impossible way it moved as it folded itself away. I couldn't explain it. I spent the rest of the night sitting beside the cot, the monitor abandoned. Every tiny noise from the house, creaks of the floorboards, faint rustles of the wind outside, set my nerves on edge. My baby slept soundly through it all, as if nothing had ever been wrong. By morning, the events of the night felt like a strange, fever dream. My husband brushed it off as exhaustion, but I couldn't shake the image. I checked every corner of the room again, every crevice. The doors stayed locked, the windows remained sealed. There was no sign of anyone, no trace of anything out of place. Still, I couldn't bring myself to look at the monitor again. It sat on the bedside table, its glow turned off. But every time I glanced at it, I felt the same prickling sense of dread. There was no rational explanation for what I'd seen, and yet the memory of that crouching figure disappearing beneath the cot lingered with a terrible clarity I couldn't ignore. The nursery stayed quiet after that. Nothing else happened, or at least nothing I could confirm. But I began to dread the nights, dreading what I might see if I ever turned the monitor back on. And though I never spoke of it again, I avoided looking directly at the cot for too long, afraid that I might catch a glimpse of something moving in the corner of my eye. I live in a small, semi-detached house on the edge of the village. It's the kind of place where the evenings are quiet enough to hear the hum of your fridge and the occasional groan of the pipes. After Claire left, it was just me and Jamie, my 6-month-old. Lonely but manageable. Nights were the hardest, though. The baby monitor became my lifeline, letting me listen in on him as I sat downstairs with the TV on low, the only light coming from the lamp in the corner. The monitor wasn't perfect. Sometimes there'd be faint static, little pops and hisses like the crackle of a distant fire. Harmless, I thought. The baby was always fine when I went to check on him. Then one evening there was something else. I noticed it as I sat there with a mug of tea gone cold in my hands. Beneath the static there was a sound, soft, intermittent, a faint exhalation, as though someone were breathing right into the microphone. Jamie's room was empty apart from him, so I chalked it up to interference, maybe from a neighbour's cordless phone or some radio signal. Technology can be strange like that. I turned the volume down a notch and carried on. The breathing came again the next night. Longer this time, interspersed with Jamie's own shallow, even breaths. It was different, slow. It didn't sound like a child. It didn't sound like anything that belonged in his room. I sat frozen in my chair for a long moment, staring at the monitor as if it might explain itself. Then, with the kind of conviction that comes more from exhaustion than courage, I went upstairs to check on him. Jamie was there in his cot, eyes closed, his little chest rising and falling. The room smelled faintly of baby powder and that sweet, milky scent he always carried. Nothing was out of place. I stood there longer than I needed to, feeling foolish but unwilling to leave straight away. Eventually, I crept back downstairs, turning the monitor down so low I could barely hear it. The next few nights were uneventful, and I almost forgot about it, but then, just as I was starting to relax, it came again. The breathing, it filled the room downstairs this time, louder than before. It wasn't regular, it paused and restarted, as though someone were hovering right over the cot, leaning in and then pulling away. My skin prickled. I forced myself upstairs, my heart thudding hard enough to feel in my throat. Jamie was asleep, peaceful. The room was still, but there was something about the air. It felt strange, not colder, not warmer, just different. I stood there for longer than I meant to, trying to shake the sense that I wasn't alone. A few nights passed without incident, but I kept the monitor muted, relying on the little green light that flashed with the sound. If he cried, I'd hear him anyway. At least that's what I told myself. But a part of me was afraid to hear it again. The breathing. Then came the night I couldn't ignore it. Jamie had gone down easily, and I was sitting in the armchair, the monitor on the table beside me. I wasn't even looking at it when the sound began. Not just breathing this time, a low, warbling hum, a few notes rising and falling in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. It was unmistakably human, a voice, soft, tuneless, singing right into the microphone. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the monitor and pressed the button to speak, my voice cracking as I barked out a single question. Silence answered. I ran upstairs, taking the steps two at a time. Jamie was awake, his little face screwed up in that prelude to a wail, his hands flailing weakly. I scooped him up, my eyes darting to every corner of the room. It was empty, of course it was. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the next night either. The monitor stayed off. Jamie slept in my room, his cot shoved up against my bed. I told myself it was better this way, safer. But now, even without the monitor, I can hear it. Not every night, but often enough. That faint, unsteady breathing just outside my bedroom door. Sometimes I feel the air shift slightly, as though someone's standing too close. When I work up the nerve to look, there's nothing there, but I know it's there.